Mergers. They happen in all sectors of business. Some work out, and some don't. Today we'll be talking about one that didn't exactly work out. But first, we're going to have to go back in time a little bit. In 1899, brothers James and William Packard built the first Packard automobile in their native Warren, Ohio. A year later, the brothers formed the Ohio Automobile Company in partnership with George Weiss. I think that's how you say it. If not, well, sorry I mispronounced her name, even though you're probably dead. Which was soon renamed the Packard Motor Car Company and moved to Detroit, Michigan. The company grew rapidly and soon became America's preeminent luxury automobile manufacturer. Packard was an early leader in innovation and performance. The onset of World War I saw Packard introduce its Liberty Motor airplane engine, the first ever mass-produced airplane power plant. In the fall of 1917, the War Department placed an order for 22,500 Liberty engines. Dividing the contract among the automobile and engine manufacturers Buick, Ford, Cadillac, Lincoln, Marmon, I've never heard of them before, and Packard. Packard concentrated on cars with prices starting at $2,600, while the average car was selling for under $1,000, competing with other luxury brands like Rolls-Royce and Mercedes-Benz. In the 1920s, Packard exported more cars than any other in its price class, and in 1930 sold almost twice as many abroad as any other brand priced over $2,000. In 1931, 10 Packards were owned by the Imperial House of Japan. Between 1924 and 1930, Packard was also the top-selling luxury brand, and by 1931, Packards were being produced in Canada. Then the Great Depression hit, and for some reason, Packard thought, yes, let's make our cars even more expensive. While the 8 5-seater sedan had been the company's top seller for years, the Twin Six was introduced for 1932, with prices starting at $3,650, which is equivalent to $82,000 in today's money. Okay, yeah, it's pretty affordable. However, Packard also decided to sell at a lower price point. Sounds like a great idea, right? Especially considering the economic conditions, and there was over 12 million Americans unemployed. Yeah, no. Actually, their cheaper car started out at $1,750 or $40,000 in today's money. You know, maybe they should have just folded then and there. I'm sure Barbara and Charles were definitely more worried about buying a Packard than figuring out how to feed their 4 kids. The 1920s had proven extremely profitable for the company, and it had assets of approximately $20 million in 1932, which equated to $447 million in 2023. While many luxury car manufacturers were almost broke. By 1938, Franklin, Marmon, Ruxton, Stearns Knight, Stutz, Duesenberg, and Pierce Arrow had all closed. Packard were still standing. In 1935, Packard decided selling cheaper cars was finally a good idea. The company introduced the 120, its first car under $1,000. Sales more than tripled that year and doubled again in 1936. Then, for World War II, Packard shifted to complete production for the war. During World War II, Packard again built airplane engines, licensing the Merlin engine from Rolls-Royce as the V1650, which powered the P-51 Mustang fighter. Packard also built 1350, 1400, and 1500 horsepower V12 Marine engines for the American PT boats. Each boat used 3 engines. Packard ranked 18th among United States corporations in the value of wartime production contracts. If you'd like to know more about the car companies during World War II, I have a video about that. By the end of World War II, Packard was in excellent financial condition, with assets of around $33 million, but several management mistakes became more apparent with time. Like other U.S. automobile companies, Packard resumed civilian car production in late 1945, labeling them as 1946 models, even though they were just modestly updating their 1942 models. While most automakers were able to introduce new vehicles for 1948 and 1949, Packard could not until 1951. In 1953, Kaiser merged with Willis to become Kaiser Willis. Nash-Hudson became the American Motors Corporation. The strategy for these mergers included cutting costs and strengthening their sales organizations to meet the intense competition from the Big Three. In 1953 and 1954, Ford and GM waged a brutal sales war, cutting prices and forcing cars on dealers. While this had little effect on either company, it damaged independent automakers. Nash's president, George W. Mason, thus proposed that the four major independents, which were Nash, Hudson, Packard, and Studebaker, merge into one firm, which would be the American Motors Corporation. Mason held informal discussions with Nance to outline his strategic vision, and an agreement was reached for AMC to buy Packard's Ultramatic transmissions and V8 engines. They were used in 1955, Hudson's and Nash's. It did not help that Chrysler and Ford waged a campaign of stealing Packard's dealerships during the early 1950s. By 1954, the writing was on the wall for Packard. They joined forces with Studebaker. It was hoped that Packard would benefit from Studebaker's larger dealer network, and Studebaker hoped to gain through the additional strength that Packard's cash position would provide. Studebaker had the disadvantage that its South Bend location would make consolidation difficult. Labor costs were also the highest in the industry. Once both companies stabilized their balance sheets and strengthened their product line, the original plan was devised by Packard president James Nance and now Calvinator Corporation president George W. Mason, was that the combined Studebaker-Packard company would join Nash, Calvinator, and Hudson in an all-new four-brand American Motors Corporation. Obviously, this would not be the case. Packard executives soon discovered that Studebaker had been less than forthcoming in all of its financial and sales records. The situation was considerably more dire than Nance and his team were led to believe. Studebaker's break-even point was an unreachable 282,000 cars at a time when the company had barely sold 82,000 cars in 1954. As if that weren't enough, the problems piled on with the loss of about 30% of Studebaker's dealer network by 1956. 1956 was also a disastrous sales year, which led Nance to resign, and Studebaker-Packard entered a management agreement with the Curtiss-Wright Corporation. Curtiss, led by Roy T. Hurley, insisted on major changes. All of Studebaker-Packard's defense contracts and plants where defense work was carried out were picked up by Curtiss. Packard production in Detroit was stopped, and all remaining automobile efforts were shifted to South Bend. The final Packard rolled off the assembly line on July 25, 1958. That year, Studebaker instructed company personnel to sell their Packards and use only Studebakers. In 1961, Sherwood Egbert was appointed company president. He was expected to help diversify the company. Then, in the spring of 1962, 4 years after the last Packard car had rolled off the assembly line, and 8 years following the merger between Packard and Studebaker, the company dropped Packard from its legal name, which returned to being Studebaker Corporation. And also, this is kind of weird, but Studebaker was close to joining forces with Toyota and Nissan. Not all three together. In fact, that's kind of what did them in. In 1965, Gordon Grundy of Studebaker Canada was sent by Studebaker management to Japan to investigate potential links with Nissan and Toyota to sell their vehicles badged as Studebakers. While Grundy was negotiating with Nissan to possibly import the Nissan Cedric, the Studebaker board found out about the Toyota Century, which was not introduced until February 1968. And then the attorney representing the board, former United States President Richard Nixon, asked Grundy to contact Toyota as well. Toyota was insulted at being Studebaker's second choice, and when word got out to Nissan that Grundy was also speaking with Toyota executives, Nissan ended negotiations, leaving Grundy empty-handed. Kind of like the Packers every year. Many of Studebaker's dealers either closed, took on other automakers' product lines, or converted to Mercedes-Benz dealerships following the closure of the Canadian plant. Studebaker's General Products division, which built vehicles to fulfill defense contracts, was acquired by Kaiser Industries, which built military and postal vehicles in South Bend. In 1970, American Motors purchased the division, which technically still exists today as AM General. So, was this the worst merger in history? Maybe in the car industry, but you can argue that Daimler Chrysler was just as bad or worse. And maybe I'll make a video on that and show a comparison. There will be a lot to dig through, however, it just might give Studebaker and Packard a run for their money. However, it's a shame that we lost two unique car companies through mismanagement and dishonesty. It just goes to show you, be careful who you trust and what you give your time to. Thank you for joining me today. Stay hydrated, take care of yourself and your loved ones, and peace.